Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy. It's a weekly radio show on a 30-minute show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Mariel Nanasi, the Executive Director of New Energy Economy, one of Retake's closest allies. And we're going to be discussing the legislative session, the failure of so many important energy and gas and oil legislation, and the governor's actions related to Biden's fracking moratorium. And also we're going to touch on PNM's acquisition our proposed acquisition by multinational mega corporation Avangrid. Last week, Roxanne and I talked about the Roundhouse session that was just completed. We talked about some of the big wins, big disappointments, and some of the lessons we've learned and that will carry forward. The week prior, I spoke with the legendary Sally Rogers, founder of Conservation Voters of New Mexico, and a lifelong and powerful advocate for the planet and for people. If you're driving around today and don't catch all of today's show, you can watch the show and all of our past shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and hovering over the Actions and Events page and clicking on Retake Conversations. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are doing this show on stolen Tewa land, and we want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good custodians of that land. And frankly, we need to learn a few things from them. Thank you, Tewa. And before we get started with Mariel, I just wanted to let you know that Retake is launching a 501c3 tax-deductible organization called Rethink Our Democracy. And Rethink Our Democracy now has a page on the Retake Our Democracy website. So if you go to retakeourdemocracy.org, click on Rethink, you'll find a summary of our vision, our scope of work, and our plans. And you'll also find an invite for a Zoom invite for a conversation we're going to have next Wednesday at 6 p.m. That's the 19th. I'm sorry, it's the 21st. And we're going to be talking about what this Rethink is about. So if you go to Rethink on our website, click on it, you can read what it's about, and then we're going to have a conversation about that. And this is going to be a very participatory, inclusive process. We need you as partners in this. And there's going to be various roles for people to play, including research and writing and social media. So if you're at all interested, go to Rethink. And so I think it's time to talk with Mariel. Hi, Mariel.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Paul.
It's always a pleasure. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about if you take a moment to tell us how you wound up becoming an attorney, how you wound up being an environmental advocate?
First, I want to say that I'm a mom, and my son was born 28 years ago in 3 days. Yay. So yeah, so that's like a big deal right now. I'm also, and I have a daughter as well. And I've been a civil rights lawyer for the majority of my life, and doing police misconduct mostly, false arrest and other kinds of misconduct, including police violence. And then I found out about the urgency of climate. I knew about climate change, but I didn't realize of the urgency of it till about 10 years ago. And so I decided to switch my focus because I thought, how can I look at my kids in their eyes and say that I knew about this and I didn't act. So I switched my focus. What?
I said, you've certainly acted.
Yes. And so then I started to learn, and just I'll tell you, just a year or two ago, somebody referred to me as a utility lawyer. And I thought, oh, wow, I guess I am a utility lawyer. So we work a lot in the Public Regulation Commission at the New Mexico Supreme Court. We have also gotten involved in oil and gas issues in the last couple of years. So we are about economic justice and climate justice and understanding those intersections. And of course, when you do that, you have to understand and learn about how that is also about racial injustice.
Right.
So those are our focuses.
Okay, great. So let's talk generally about the legislative session and not referencing environmental bills. We'll get to that in a minute, but just generally, how did you feel the session went, and what were some of your big pleasures or big wins and some of your disappointments?
Well, some of your listeners might have seen that we, with I think a dozen or two other organizations, gave the legislators an F for their inaction on climate, and the governor really for not pushing to have bills that really address the climate crisis that we're in. I don't know if people have been seeing, but last night I was watching CNN and saw really disturbing photographs of Wisconsin, which has lots of lakes, and it is on fire. It is on fire, and they are suffering an enormous drought. And it's rather alarming to see those photographs. And it's been very windy out there lately. I know that people have been experiencing it and feeling the different allergies that are coming up for even people who usually don't have allergies are experiencing them right now. It's windy and it's dry and it's getting drier. And I'm really concerned that this government has failed to take action on the climate crisis that we're in, and not just naming it as a climate crisis, but actually reducing carbon emissions. So no bills passed whatsoever to regulate the electric or oil and gas industry. And I'm very concerned about the corporate stranglehold that we are all seeing if we're paying attention to this legislature.
So that's very interesting, but it didn't answer the question. I said,
oh yeah,
except for energy and environment. And that's all you spoke about.
Well, you did say something. So we did finally, after, I don't know, 10 years or so of working on community solar, get community solar passed, though that was really, that was the only bill of ours that we had as a priority that got passed, but it was really weakened, and it was weakened by our Democratic legislators. And you know, I'm happy to go into depth, and there's, if you don't want to, your listeners can go to. We've got
a question on that later, Mariel, so we'll go into the depth in just a
minute.
But
I just want to say that readers can go to, listeners or can go to newenergyeconomy.org.
And you're freezing.
And they'll.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. You listeners can go to newenergy.org and get the information. And Mariel froze just when she was given that information. So hopefully that won't happen.
But it's newenergyeconomy.org. So you can get the final assessment in detail if you want about the community solar bill.
Okay. So Retake is doing a report card again this year, and one of the trends we will analyze is the failure of virtually every bill that challenges either the energy industry or the gas and oil industry. And I know this is a huge concern for you, and you just referenced it. Let's start with what Retake thought was potentially the most impactful and important environmental bill, SJR 3, the Green Amendment. What is your take on why that failed?
Well, it passed the Rules Committee, even when Senator Ivy Soto proposed amendments, he ended up withdrawing his own amendments and it got out of rules. So that was good. It was on a straight party line vote. Democrats voted to pass it to the next committee, and then it just wasn't heard in judiciary. And so, like so many other bills, including, I believe, 15 bills that had complete unanimous support from the House, were never even heard, were never given a hearing in judiciary. And I think that there were about 150 bills that were stalled there. So we were not the only victim, that's for sure.
Right.
But there was a lot of promise around the Green Amendment. We wanted to there is a provision in the Constitution to protect the environment, but this would have strengthened that protection and would have located it specifically in the Bill of Rights section,
Right.
which would have given anybody a right to demand protection of the environment. And it's needed. We are facing an environmental crisis with especially oil and gas, but not only. We still have a methane cloud that's hovering over the San Juan Basin, and we have an enormous crisis with these fracked wastewater discharges and spills that are basically creating an environmental disaster. At least somewhere between 2 and 4 major spills a day.
Right. So another bill Retake supported, and you obviously did as well, and very strongly, and it was one of our transformational bills on our list, was SB 83, the Local Choice Energy Bill. That also failed. Tell our listeners how this bill would have benefited New Mexico and why you feel it didn't progress very far at all.
Well, I think this is just one of the most exciting possibilities. And I want to just explain what it is by explaining what happened with the water utility in Santa Fe. In 1995, the city of Santa Fe bought the water utility from P&M. Some people, including the older water utility director, believed that we would literally be bankrupt, meaning out of water in Santa Fe, had P&M continued to own it. P&M, of course, is a private public service company of New Mexico. It's called Public Service, but they are a private monopoly utility. And their goal, this is not like, oh, it's so bad. It's their goal. They have a fiduciary duty to make as much money as absolutely possible for their shareholder investors. So they were in charge of the water utility. And we were using at that time 14,000 acre feet of water in 1995. And the city paid to own the utility. And now the city of Santa Fe owns that utility. Well, when the city of Santa Fe owns the utility, it is not a it's not a for-profit entity, it's ours. It's a essentially community owned or locally owned utility. And what have we done? If all of you want to go, it's right on the water utility website. It's a rather amazing graphic chart. And if you look at how much money, how much water we are using right now, it is about half the amount of water is being consumed in Santa Fe that was today than was being consumed in 1995. And that means that when we're a not-for-profit entity, we can focus on other concerns besides profit. We can focus our priorities on reliability and resiliency and making sure that we protect our most vulnerable. And we've done that with water in New Mexico. Some people think that it's one of the best water utilities in the country. And so that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of pride, frankly. And we've been adding people since 1995. It's not like
Right.
Santa Fe is shrinking, right? So what if we did that with energy? I want to tell you that I believe in my heart that if we owned our own energy utility in Santa Fe, call it Santa Fe Public Power, then we could, I believe, get to 100% clean energy within 5 years at rates that are equal to or less than Public Service Company of New Mexico. And we see this when Kit Carson bought its freedom out of a 40-year contract from Tri-State and became its owner. It decides now how to spend money, what to invest in, what kinds of resources to promote, et cetera, et cetera. They are on track to be 100% renewable next year. So we're not talking about the 2045 or something like that. We're talking about within 5 years, we could be in control of our energy. And that's what local choice energy is about. It's about—
It's such a great thing. Why did it get killed?
Yeah, I just think that and it's interesting that the city of Santa Fe, the county of Santa Fe, the city of Las Cruces, the city of Albuquerque, Mayor Weber wrote comments himself, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, all of them supported it. Why? Because they believe that they could produce energy for their constituents, for their members, for their communities at a cheaper rate with cleaner energy. And it passed conservation also on a straight Democratic, Democrat versus Republican vote, and was headed to Tax Revenue and Transportation Committee, with the chair being Senator Benny Shendo. And we had this All Pueblo Council of Governors resolution, and we only lost by 1 vote. Senator Michael Padilla and Senator Martin Hickey voted with the Republicans to table it. And I did have a conversation with Senator Hickey beforehand, and so it was disappointing to see his vote. But hopefully we will bring it back again. And it's a change. It's a major change in our system. But I believe it's a needed change. There are 9 states. We would have been the 10th state to adopt this kind of paradigm shift in locally controlled energy. And just to that what happened in Texas, some of you know, I'll just be very quick about this, is that there was a freeze. It was anticipated. There was some really evil-spirited companies that charged, I forget exactly, but I think oil was selling for $2.50 an MMBTU a week before the Texas freeze. And during the Texas freeze, it sold for over $250 an MMBTU. So these private corporations took advantage of this freeze. I know that some of you heard, executives gloating and boasting about the fact that they took advantage of this crisis. That's not how responsible Santa Fe would be to its members. And it happened around fossil fuels. Solar kept on working throughout the process. Even PNM and some of the other utilities admit that the solar, although it's a tiny percentage of the whole, performed as it was expected.
Yeah, well, we've got to take a little break here so I can remind our listeners that it is times like these that KSFR is more important than ever. They offer you timely news, cultural information, music, political shows like Retake Our Democracy and Richard Wolff. And So for those of you who can afford it, consider making a contribution and think of it as your ticket for admission to some really great programming. So go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button, and plunk down 10, 20, 50, $200,000 and make them smile. Let's get back to talking with Mariel Nanasi, the Executive Director of New Energy Economy. And so far, we've been talking about the sad fate of so many environmental bills. One of the rare climate crisis bills that actually passed and was signed into law was community solar. You mentioned it briefly, but NEE and Retake both worked hard to try and get that passed for several years, and yet it was gutted by an amendment that undermined the bill's purpose. I never really did delve into what those amendments were, but I understand from you that they basically made the bill, the implementation of community solar, pretty problematic. Can you lay out what those amendments were and where they came from?
Well, I don't know where they came from, but I can only imagine that they came from PNM. And this is why. There's nobody in the legislature that knows about, not a single person that would have come up with these amendments. But rather than talk about all the amendments that happened and then some of them were changed back and blah, blah, I'd like to just focus on the end result. But I have to tell you that when Senator Ivy Soto and Senator Duhigg brought those amendments, I thought, okay, they've killed community solar. The House did modify the bill again, and it was ultimately signed with only some of the bad things still remaining. And I'll try to go through really quickly what's going to be really, the enormous hurdles. I mean, what I want to just first frame this in and can give you a context of is we are the 20th community solar, 20th state in the nation to have community solar. What we did was we spent, 4 months every 2 weeks at meetings coming up with a bill that would highlight the best practices and be the best bill in the United States, learning from what has happened before. But that didn't happen because, that's how it started. But then, as you said, these amendments were put in at the behest of the utilities. And I'll just go quickly through. There's about 5 or 6 really tough hurdles. So the first one is that they're subject to PRC regulation. Now, this was sold as consumer protection, but no other state in the entire country does a community solar project is subject to PRC regulation. The idea is that the market will help, figure out the issues for these solar projects. Now, these solar projects have very little margin. And so if they are subject to PRC regulation, just imagine this: you have to hire a lawyer, you have to file something at the PRC, and then it has to be approved. And there's just many steps and a lot of time, and time is money, of course. And it becomes a real burden. I hope that I can help and that the PRC will draft some rules that will be streamlined for these projects so that it doesn't become just essentially a bureaucratic web that no projects would even ever come to fruition. So that's one big thing. Now, just so you know, the reason that PNM is subject to Public Regulation Commission is because they have no competition within their geographic area. So the idea is that P&M is subject to regulation because they have no competition, in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And so the PRC is supposed to act as an in-between to protect ratepayers, but that's not the situation with community solar. So that's one of the big things, but I understand.
Mariel, let me ask you something. I'm wary of the time. Yeah. And we can talk more about the community solar and the other environmental bills, for the podcast after, but we've got about 4 minutes left in the radio show. And I want to make sure our radio listeners hear your take on P&M's acquisition by Avangrid. And so can you tell us a little bit about what that is and why we don't want it?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for being a good timekeeper. And so the situation is that this is an international company owned by Spain. It's a Spanish-owned company. Iberdrola owns Avangrid, and they want to come in and merge with P&M. And they are paying about $4.3 billion to buy P&M, and P&M is only worth $2 billion. So why are they coming here? They're coming here because they see that New Mexico can be a market for them to exploit and for them to take our resources and continue this unfortunate colonialist energy colony situation, but on steroids, because Iberdrola, the parent company of Avangrid, has about 20 times the resources that P&M does. And so that what they're seeking to do is take our solar and take our wind and export it to Arizona and California and to Mexico, the country of Mexico. And so, and in return, it will also, continue as the monopoly utility here. And we're just concerned. There's been a dozen interveners. So those are like the city of Albuquerque and Bernalillo County and New Energy Economy and others that have intervened and have raised a number of issues that we believe, as the current application sits, makes this merger not in the public interest. Not good for P&M ratepayers and not good for New Mexicans. And I
mean, we could develop that energy ourselves and export it to other states and so forth. And that's where, so this is basically an extractive industry in another form of taking not oil out of our ground, but taking wind out of our air and solar out of our sun and profiting off of it, with us getting basically nothing. So I think there's more to this story, and we're going to talk about that on the podcast. We're going to take we're going to let Mariel tell people how they can get more information about New Energy Economy, and then we'll take a 10-second break so that the radio station knows we're done, and then we'll come back and we'll finish the conversation. So Mariel, do you want to tell our listeners how they can find out more about your great organization?
Thank you, Paul. Please go to newenergyeconomy.org, and there's information, a whole case description about the P&M Avangrid merger. And soon there will be a petition to sign about this. And there's plenty of information about the case. And we'd love to talk to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mariel. And as I said, we'll be back for the podcast in just a second. New listeners on the radio can go to retakeourdemocracy.org to the retake to the actions and events and menu and click on Retake Conversations. And you can hear the rest of this conversation. And there's a lot more. We're going to talk a lot more about the environmental bills. We're going to talk a lot more about the Avangrid proposal. And so just a final note to our listeners, please stay safe, stay healthy. We're not out of this yet. So mask and distance. And at least for those of us who are now vaccinated, Mariel and myself, we can get together and see each other in just a few short days. So thank you very much for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay active. It's the only way we're going to fix this mess. Thank you. Okay, by the miracle of podcast, we're back with Mariel Nanasi. And tell us more about the Avangrid thing. I mean, is it not the case that I could foresee them coming in and saying, you know what, we need to run a transmission line through Chaco Canyon, and we're going to do that by eminent domain? I could see all kinds of scenarios like that. That might be extreme, but it might not. Tell us what more we can expect. I understand that they're having some problems themselves in Maine, where they're also the utility in Maine. Talk to us a little bit about all of that.
So Avangrid is, you know, a multi-international company, but they have lots of investments already in the United States. And one of those is in Maine, and they own Central Maine Power. Mm-hmm. And you know, one of the things is like, if you want to find out about what you believe someone will do or some company will do, the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. Right. And the past behavior of Avangrid in Maine, for instance, is very concerning. First of all, even though they're a renewable energy company, they wanted to own it all. And so they thought, hey, rooftop solar and community solar were a threat to their business. So they created a front group and they paid off legislators. And, you know, Maine is poor, like New Mexico is. And Maine also really cares about their tourism industry, like New Mexico, because it's a very beautiful place for anybody who's been, and they have pristine forests. And basically, Avangrid wanted to literally bulldoze the forest to put up these transmission lines so they could have a transmission line go from Canada to Connecticut, which they own another utility there. And they did some shady stuff. They invested more money in more dark money into different groups, including front groups and the Maine Chamber of Commerce, and gave money to campaign contributions, which we're, you know, seeing P&M do that stuff. But Avangrid has 20 times the money that P&M does, so they could have even more influence, and so that impacts our democracy. And
have to retake it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that's a concern of mine. And then the other thing is that they are literally at the very last, out of all utilities in the country. There's a, you know, just like an industry group that does customer satisfaction surveys, and found for 3 years in a row that Central Maine Power, well, since Avangrid has owned it, is the very last, bottom of the barrel for all customer satisfaction. So those are pretty worrisome stats. Yeah. Plus, there's a group there that's sort of like the new energy economy of Maine. It's called Our Power. And for people who follow Bill McKibben in the New Yorker, he invited Our Power to write something about what's happening in Maine. And basically, they want what we want, which is local choice energy. And they call it, I think they call it like community owned utility. I think that's their acronym is COU. And I think that's what it is, stands for, community owned utility. And we call it local choice energy. But it's basically the same thing, which is let the community decide what it wants, what kind of energy, let it make the money, not right now we export our money to Wall Street through P&M, but this proposition would be exporting our money in New Mexico every time we pay our electric bill to go to Spain. There's something else that I want to say, and that is Avangrid's already in New Mexico. It owns something called the El Cabo Wind Project. And the commission, the PRC, the Public Regulation Commission, ordered Avangrid to file certain compliance filings that it's unimportant what they are, but zoning things and whatever. And they didn't do it. So that's another thing, like they haven't even they're not even involved in the merger hasn't happened yet. But what we do know of them is that they haven't complied with the law. And that's particularly problematic to me. Another thing is that when there's been mergers in the past, and there just was one with EPE, El Paso Electric, another electric monopoly, but that's in their geographic concentration is in the Las Cruces area. There was a decision that was made in 2020, in February 2020, and approved by the commission in a unanimous decision. And there were certain requirements that EPE and JP Morgan, when they merged, had to follow. So one of them, for instance, is an independent board. Now, the reason that's so important is because who's calling the shots? Is it going to be Iberdrola from Spain calling the shots, or is it going to be some local independent board members? So many of the interveners in this case, and I told you that a dozen of whom have said that we believe that this application is not in the public interest, have required as a condition of approval independent board members so that they're not controlled like little puppets from Spain, from this. I should tell you that Iberdrola is owned, I told you, 81% by the Spanish company, but you know what? 9% of it is owned by the wealth fund of Qatar. So that's really comforting to know. You know, people who don't let women drive. Anyway, the thing is that Avangrid won't agree to that. Well, that's the law here. That is the law. That is the law right now in the PRC, independent board members. And so far, P&M and Avangrid won't agree to that. Another thing that, for instance, that is required of a merger is a rate freeze. So P&M and Avangrid have offered, or Avangrid has offered, to give ratepayers $24.6 million. Well, that sounds like a lot of money. That sounds good. But there are 480,000 residential ratepayers in New Mexico. And guess what that comes to? It comes to 59 cents. We asked this in what's called discovery, where we get to ask the questions of P&M and Avangrid, and they answered it. And they said, we are proposing to give 59 cents to every residential ratepayer every month for 3 years. Well, that comes to a whopping $21, probably the cost of a lunch or two, depending on where you go. So that's what Avangrid wants to give ratepayers, is $21 per meter, right? Per residential meter. But guess how much they're giving shareholders? $200 million. So that's 10 times what ratepayers are getting. And guess how much they're giving the 6 senior management? 6 of them are going to get $38 million. So 6 people get $38 million, and 480,000 residential ratepayers, and I am one of them, will get $21.
All right, I think
So-
you've pretty much grilled this thing into the ground. I'm going to definitely be encouraging our readers to listen to the full podcast, because the last bit of evidence and information is pretty compelling. We had been talking about community solar and some of the things that were wrong with it, and I kind of cut you off a little bit there so that we could get to some part of the discussion of Avangrid on the radio show. So you had mentioned one of the amendments. I don't think we want to go through all 5, but if you could give us a sense of maybe 1 or 2 other amendments that are particularly toxic, that might be great.
I think that one thing that appears to be good, but is really problematic in reality is this. And P&M was pretty wise about this. One of the things that we said was that this would grant access. That community solar would grant access to people who didn't otherwise have the ability to invest in solar. And what we wanted to do was create as much access to as many people as possible to, in essence, stimulate the deployment of solar and the reliance on solar. And so we wanted that for small businesses. We wanted that for residential ratepayers. We wanted that so that, let's say, a mall could have, you know, community solar on the top. Like, think about our mall on the south side, right? And every one of the, you know, businesses could invest in the community solar project to the extent that they needed to offset their bills and get a credit on their bills. Well, we also wanted it for low-income folks. And we were imagining that, like, a church might do that, or a city might do that and have a solar project and, in essence, subsidize the cost of that solar, especially the initial investment, so that low-income folks could have stable electricity rates. That was the idea.
Mm-hmm.
But P&M took our goal to support low-income access and made it a requirement that every single project would require a 30% carve out for low-income people. So imagine that you have a housing community. Well, if there's no low-income people in that housing community, you can't have a community solar project. Or that mall example that I gave, you couldn't do that because no small business is going to have, you know, be low income. So it really added another hurdle. So it's going to be tougher. And so, you know, like I told you before, having each community solar project be regulated by the PRC, that's a hurdle. Having each project require that 30% of the project be low income owned, that's another hurdle. I'm not saying that these things can't be overcome. They're just barriers to what we wanted, which was greater access to really stimulate a whole new market. There's a couple of others.
It's interesting, Mariel, because one of the things we're going to be reporting on in the report card is the degree to which industry will allow bills to move forward through a few committees and basically have somebody in the legislature prepared to introduce a really toxic amendment that undoes everything. And that's what happened to community solar. It's what happened to SB 66, the predatory lending bill. So this is something we have to figure out because you know, they just don't have enough time to study these amendments in detail. and they pop up, and then you have to vote. And like you say, it sounds good, so you vote for it, and it's not good. So
Yeah, and I mean, I just will tell you that we one of the reasons we supported this bill was because of having low income access and having a carve out for people with less financial means. So it's not like we don't believe in that, but we wanted all sorts of kinds of solar projects to bloom across this state and not be not have these kinds of constraints that were put on at the last minute. Really will just make it more difficult. And the reason we ultimately still supported the bill is because the solar developers said, we'll figure out a way. We're going, we are going to be savvy and navigate around this, but it's not going to be easy. And that's not the kind of bill we wanted.
right. So now the $1 million question. We've talked about some specific instances, whether it's local choice energy, whether it's community solar, whether it's the Green Amendment, where environmental bills were stalled or killed. What's going on? I mean, we all know that gas and oil and P&M flood money to those legislators and to the governor, but is it just that? And is it, to what degree are we ever going to be able to get anything done if the legislature's kind of beholden to industry? And, I've heard from a couple of legislators that, the governor really doesn't want to sign any of these bills that are going to really challenge gas and oil. And that she basically tells Democratic Party leadership in both chambers, futz around with it all you want, but don't get it to my desk. And so that's behind the scenes going on. What do you think about all of that?
Well, I think even more than the bills that you raised, I mean, I think that the thing is, first of all, you talk about transformational bills. Why do you talk about that? You talk about that because we are facing so many crises: climate, inequality, racism. And what we're looking for are different ways to run our economy, and so that there's more fairness and less harm. And so that's why so many of them didn't pass, is because the people with the money are saying it's just fine for us. We want the status quo. But really, if you care about New Mexico, you have to understand that we're trashing it. We're trashing this place that we love. Many of us have come here from other places because it's so beautiful. And because we want to be close to nature, we want to be close to each other. And as you started the whole program, Native people have stewarded this land for so long, and that's another reason why we've come here, is because there's so much beauty and they've taken care of it, but it's being trashed right now, and we're hurting each other, and this is not the way that we will survive. We need resiliency and we need resistance. And we need new ideas with way different ways that are in concert with nature, not in opposition or domination over nature. And Native people see themselves as one with nature. So I think that one of the things that was the most striking to me, one moment, and I spent ridiculous number of hours on Zoom during the legislature, was when we had this produced water, which is toxic waste flow back from oil and gas. And I said that there's all these spills happening at an alarming rate. And I'm talking about thousands of gallons, per year, that are just spilled and contaminate our waterways and our earth here. And it's ongoing. And so this is radioactive toxic waste water. And Mimi Stewart, the pro tem, said she was voting against the bill because it was a danger to industry. Well, what about a danger to the earth and to the people?
Mhm.
And that was sort of sums up the answer to your question, which is like, for short-term gain and a unbelievable dependence on oil and gas and the utilities, we're going to let them flood the pockets of legislators and the governor and undermine our democracy. And unfortunately, like there's this great a great report done by Common Cause and then updated by New Mexico Ethics Watch, and it talks about oceans of influence by these companies. And it's really unfortunate, and we're not going to find solutions unless we can change this dynamic. And
So let me ask you this, Mariel, this will be the last question. You painted a pretty bleak picture and a kind of an entrenched situation. The governor is very likely to win re-election, and so that's 5.5 years of that administration. And so if we're correct about her not wanting to rock the boat for New Mexico Oil and Gas, or at PNM for that matter. And, we just did this 3 election cycles of substantially transforming the legislature, and it's still not getting things done. I mean, we got a lot of great bills through the legislature this session, but none of them had anything to do with climate change. And so what do we do? What do our listeners do? What do retake people do? What does NEE do to counter this power base?
This is what I think about all day long, every day. We have to grow our movement, and we have to be creative, and we can't do the same kinds of things that we've always done. We have to hold these legislators accountable. Nothing got passed, as you said, and nothing has gotten passed year after year after year to regulate the dirtiest, wealthiest industries. But they're killing us. They're killing us. I saw this one beautiful picture. It was beautiful in its truth, but it was very sad. And it was a young woman, and she had a sign, and the sign said, "You're gonna die of old age, and I'm gonna die of climate change." And I feel like we need to have that sign and have that picture of that girl every day when we wake up, and know who we are responsible to. And I want to be responsible to that young woman. Of course, I would like to be liked by the governor and Brian Egoff and all those powerful people, but I'd rather be responsible to that young girl. And I think it's where we have to focus our energy, and we have to do everything we can. And that if you're an artist, you have to draw your heart out. And if you're a lawyer, you have to write great briefs. And if you're a great organizer, you have to tell another story and get into another room and broaden the movement. And whatever you do, you got to keep on building up this power. It's like this situation. I mean, we've all been watching probably the situation of police murder that is just ongoing. And those Black people aren't giving up. And the good white people who are finding, you know, their loyalty to humanity, and to other Black people who are just being slaughtered.
Right.
And they keep going out and keep on speaking up. And we just have to keep on doing that and being out in the streets and doing whatever we possibly can. And please follow Retake Our Democracy, and please follow New Energy Economy, because there will be lots of actions and things that people can do. The real thing is to just not tune out. The real thing is not to tune out, and to turn up the volume in whatever you're doing, and to love more fiercely, and to love that young woman, and the message, the truth, the beauty behind what has a right to live, you know, just like we did.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mariel. I appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy, busy person, and looking forward to seeing you in about a week.
It's gonna be somebody's birthday.
So yeah, somebody's birthday. So anyway, I want to thank you very much. Hugs to Jeff, and to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us at retakeourdemocracy.org and our Retake Conversation with Mariel Nanasi, New Energy Economy Executive Director. We'll be back next week.